Well, hello, everyone. It's just 12 o'clock. It's 12 o'clock noon on Tuesday, so it's time for Zoom and the Tuesday Lunch and Learn series with the Woodrow Wilson House. My name is Elizabeth Karcher, and I'm the Executive Director at the Woodrow Wilson House. We are a site of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's talk. It is timely and it's necessary, and I'm very, very pleased that we're able to have this talk today about, we've invited Dana Tysoon Burgess and his dance company to make a presentation along with and in collaboration with the Korean Cultural Center here in Washington, D.C. The Tuesday Speaker Series, as you know, is every second and fourth Tuesday of each month at the Woodrow Wilson House. It is generously sponsored by donations. We have donations from Nancy Bliss, Chris Keller, Ed Gerber, and Carrie Fuller. And were it not for their generous donations, we wouldn't be able to support, the Woodrow Wilson House would not be able to support this speaker series. So it is with heartfelt thanks that I say thank you. This is really terrific that we're able to do this. If you would like to make donations to the Woodrow Wilson House, of course, we welcome them. So you can go onto our website and make a donation. If you've enjoyed this program and you'd like to see more programming like this, then please make a donation.
Hello, I'm Jun-Seok Hwang, Director of the Korean Cultural Center, Washington, D.C. We are pleased to host this event in partnership with the President Woodrow Wilson House, a national historic landmark located here in the capital. The history of Korean immigration to the United States began on the sugarcane plantations of Hawaii in 1903. It is already over 100 years old. Since then, the Korean American community has grown to more than 1.8 million people. The recent award-winning film Minari provides an interesting reflection point for this history. It invites us to rethink the lives of Korean immigrants and the meaning behind their experiences. As in the film, many Koreans indeed came to the United States in search of the American dream. And in the country of immigrants, generations of these families contributed greatly to their adopted nation. With hard work and creativity, Korean Americans have impacted American society, economy, culture, art, and beyond. Their history is now part of American history and is truly worth studying. I hope this event will give us all an opportunity to better understand this history and the future legacy that Korean Americans continue to write. Thank you.
Thank you. So with that, I would like to make an introduction of Dr. Julie Park. She is an associate professor at the University of Maryland in College Park at the University of Maryland. And she studies race and diversity in higher education. And she's going to make a presentation. So Dr. Julie Park, I welcome you. Please.
Great. Well, thank you for that lovely introduction. First of all, I'd like to thank Peg Hemi from the Korean Cultural Center, Washington, D.C., for the invitation to come to speak with you today. And also Elizabeth Karcher from the President Woodrow Wilson House for bringing together the speaker series. Before I begin, especially as the director of an Asian American Studies program, I would be remiss if I did not first acknowledge the 8 victims murdered, 4 of whom were Korean American women in the horrific Georgia shooting last week. It was a senseless act of anti-Asian racism and gendered violence. I hope each of you find support in your community as we all try to make sense of this and take some small act of change. So with that, let me first get my PowerPoint up. So today, I would like to share with you the history of Korean immigration in the United States. And I believe the director of the Korean Cultural Center has already shared a little bit of what I'm going to talk about, but we'll just go with it. So it begins with when diplomatic relations between Korea and the United States was established in 1882. In this new relationship, American Presbyterian and Methodist missionaries went to Korea to convert many to Christianity. But in the United States, there was the first 10 Korean envoys who arrived in Washington, D.C. One of them happened to be Byung-soo, who later pursued a Bachelor of Science degree from my campus, the University of Maryland College Park. He is one of, if not the first of Koreans to get an American college degree. So we now have a conference room actually named in his honor on our campus today. Also, there was the purchasing of the Korean Legation Building in 1889, which to this day serves as the sole example of 19th century diplomatic mission buildings in DC. After the initial establishment of diplomatic relations, there are basically three broad periods or waves of Korean immigration to the United States. So first, the first wave was during the first half of the 20th century from 1903 to 1949. As Dana will share with you later on in the presentation, the first sizable group of Korean immigrants arrived in Hawaii between January 1903 and July 1905. As you can see in the image of the Hawaiian Star newspaper, an article announces the very first arrivals on the Gaelic. Approximately 7,200 Koreans were recruited to work on the sugar plantations. It was with the promises of the good life in quote unquote paradise. And unlike other Asian immigrants of the time, Korean immigrants were non-farming workers. They were clergymen, scholars, former soldiers, students, and they came from cities, unlike those who came from rural areas. 70% were literate, and 40% of the pioneer Korean immigrants were Christians. Due to the harsh living and working conditions on the plantations, many left to other jobs in Hawaii or to the continental US in a year or two. And between 1910 and 1924, approximately 1,100 Korean women arrived under the Picture Bride system. Another 600 arrived as political refugees and students who were involved in the anti-Japanese independence movement. However, along with the Japanese prohibiting immigration, as well as the 1917 Asiatic Barred Zone Act and the 1924 National Origins Act, it effectively stopped all immigration to the United States, except from Northern and Western Europe. The US entered into the silent era of immigration, and it lasted for decades. Only a few Korean political refugees and intellectuals continued to immigrate to the US to study while Korea was under Japanese rule. Almost immediately after gaining independence from Japan in 1945, Korea became the center of the Cold War, which ultimately resulted in the Korean War between 1950 and 1953. Korea became two countries. During the second wave, which is really more like a trickle than a wave, when you look at the annual immigration numbers on the graph, the strong ties between the US and South Korea contributed to a small but steadily increasing stream of Korean immigrants, with approximately 15,000 total arriving between 1946 and 1964. The vast majority of immigrants at that time were Korean women married to US servicemen and Korean adoptees, many of whom were biracial children of US servicemen. Or they were Korean students pursuing a graduate education, with most of these students staying as they found professional occupations here. The third wave, or the post-1965 wave, continues to today. More than 95% of all Korean immigrants and their children are a part of this wave. The Immigration Act of 1965, contrary to popular belief, was not intended to bring such racial and ethnic diversity to the US through immigration. As seen here, President Lyndon Johnson signed the bill symbolically in front of the Statue of Liberty, but stated, quote, "This bill that we will sign today is not a revolutionary bill, does not affect the lives of millions. It will not reshape the structure of our lives." No one could have anticipated it would be the beginning of welcoming tens of millions of immigrants within the next several decades. The law that was passed, it was based on a preference system for skilled workers, family reunification, and refugees, instead of the national origins quota system, which was previously in place. Lawmakers, however, did not anticipate how family reunification could increase the immigrant population so quickly. So let's take, for example, how my family was able to immigrate to the US. There was a woman who was a war bride in South Korea and immigrated to the United States to be with her husband. She applied to bring her immediate family, which included 4 sisters. However, they were all married and had children, so they then bring their immediate families. And one of the 4 sisters happened to be married to my uncle. And then he in turn sends for his brother, my dad, who then also brings his wife, my mother, and 2 daughters, including me. And so this is how my family immigrated from South Korea to the United States in 1978. So you can see how one immigrant could end up bringing many immigrants with them. The number of South Korean immigrants gradually increased beginning in 1965, and by 1976, more than 30,000 arrived every year until 1990. During this accelerating period, as Pyonggap Min refers to it, Korea sent the 3rd largest number of immigrants behind Mexico and the Philippines. Given the relatively small population size in South Korea and the Philippines relative to other Asian countries, their significant immigration is strongly related to their military, political, and economic ties to the US. Some of the major push factors in South Korea included poverty, lack of jobs, job opportunities, as well as political insecurity. This compelled many to immigrate during the 1970s and 80s. And soon, these push factors greatly diminished over time by the improving economic and political conditions after 1990 in South Korea. Only about 13,000 immigrated annually during the 90s. And perhaps this is also due to the chilling effect of the 1992 Los Angeles civil unrest. But then immigration rebounded to approximately 23,000 immigrants arriving annually in the 2000s. In the 21st century, one notable trend is a very high share of status adjusters amongst Korean immigrants, which can get to over 80%. Many are coming as international students or temporary visitors who then adjust to a permanent immigrant status once they are in the US. Unlike Korean immigrants in the past who got lawful permanent resident status through family reunification, now approximately 60% are attaining permanent status through their employer. All this brings us to the present. Currently, actually this is an updated number from what the director gave. There are approximately 1.9 million Americans who identify as Korean in the United States. Interestingly enough, and partially due to the large numbers of adoptees who've come into the United States, nearly a quarter of them identify as biracial or multiracial Korean. Among those who solely identify as Korean, 72% or 3 out of 4 of them are immigrants. The top 2 destinations for Korean immigrants are of course Los Angeles and New York, but Washington DC is a pretty good third, comes in third with approximately 98,000 Korean American residents. The San Francisco, San Jose area is next, and Seattle, Chicago, and Atlanta round out the next 3 metro areas with the most Korean immigrants. Now, for social and economic status indicators, it's not a clear-cut picture. And really, there is quite a bit of diversity within. So on the one hand, Korean immigrants have higher educational attainment than the US average. 54% of Korean immigrants have a bachelor's degree or higher compared to 32% for the US. Likewise, 20% of Korean immigrants have a graduate or professional degree compared to 12% for the US. And a full 51% have management, business, science, and art occupations compared to only 39% for the US as a whole. But on the other hand, 50% of Korean immigrants report that they have limited English proficiency. Also, Korean immigrants have the highest self-employment rate amongst Asian immigrants. Now, of course, there are quite a few examples of extremely successful entrepreneurs, like those who founded Forever 21, Pinkberry, Fitbit, Julep, just to name a few. But there are also many who have created ethnic niches in the beauty supply business, dry cleaning, liquor stores, shoe repair. Some are successful, but many struggle. That often results in higher uninsured rates for health coverage and higher poverty, 12% versus 11% for the US. Many Americans often assume that Asian Americans are a monolith with high levels of education, prestigious jobs, and economic security. Basically, that dreaded model minority stereotype, the crazy rich Asians. But there's so much more social and economic diversity within each Asian ethnic group. And this is certainly the case for Korean immigrants. In my most current research project on Korean immigrants in the DC area who arrived during the 1960s to the 1980s, and their children and grandchildren, I find that most immigrated with very little, and they took jobs in kitchens, car repair garages, furniture factories, mini blind factories, and other jobs that helped them to start on their American dream. Many came with hopes to better their lives, more importantly, the lives of their children. These immigrants are now in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, and they consider the United States their home, while the Korea they knew is now only a place frozen in their memory. As I interview their now middle-aged children, these 1.5 and second generation Americans share their memories of being a constant interpreter for their parents, which felt like a parental role reversal, staying home alone as latchkey kids to fend for themselves, and constantly being reminded that they are, in fact, their parents' American dream. So the director mentioned the film Minari, and it's a recent award-winning movie, and it has garnered 6 Oscar nominations. And it really captures the hopes and challenges of Korean immigrants so beautifully. For those of you who haven't seen it, I highly recommend you see it. It is set in the 1980s when a Korean immigrant family moves to rural Arkansas from California to live out the father's, who's played by Stephen Yeun, dreams of having his own farm. The parents have very limited English, take up menial jobs to survive while trying to start up the farm. There's a palpable tension between the couple due to economic strains. While the children are more comfortable speaking English, they resent living with their grandmother and have a slow start in making friends at church and at school. Ultimately, the grandmother bonds with the children by taking them to a nearby stream to plant minari, which translates to water celery, a plant that is very common in Korea, and it is eaten in various dishes. The plant is known for putting down roots quickly, growing well almost anywhere in the sun or the shade, and it's easy to care for. While the father toils to yield his first crop, the minari effortlessly grows and flourishes. The writer, Lee Isaac Chung, chose the symbolic title Minari because, quote, he says, it grows very expansively without doing much to it. The interesting thing about it is that it's a plant that will grow very strong in its second season after it dies and comes back. Like the minari plant, Korean immigrants land in different parts of the US, some in very harsh conditions, Yet with time, they lay down their roots. And before they know it, their second generation children begin to flourish and their families grow in the very same way so many immigrant groups did before them. As Sandra Oh, during a panel discussion after a screening of Minari said, the film is a Korean immigrant story, an American immigrant story, a quintessential American story. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Park. That was very informative. I appreciate that. Really very, very good to see that. Thank you. We have Dana Tysoon Burgess from the Dana Tysoon Burgess, the founder and executive director of the dance company, is going to present a dance that we have a video of it. It is the tracings that was done in 2003. So I think without any further we'll hold our questions to the end. We'll have the presentation and then we'll have the questions. So just give me a moment. I'll share my screen and we'll see the video. And I'd ask if everyone can just mute their phones and we'll get started. Everyone sees the screen?
No.
No?
No.
Hold on, there we go.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for showing that excerpt from this dance. The dance is actually a little over an hour long in total, but it was really nice to see these excerpts. I want to thank the Woodrow Wilson House and the Embassy of Korea, so 감사합니다. It's, I think, so timely for us to have this discussion about Korean immigration and how Koreans are woven into the fabric of the United States itself. So in creating tracings, I received a phone call in 2002 from the Smithsonian's Asian Pacific American office, and they asked if I would consider creating a work which would celebrate the centennial of Korean immigration to America, specifically to Hawaii in 2003. So I was honored and thrilled. And then I was thrust into this choreographic and personal journey to explore my family history, because I knew that my great-grandparents had arrived in Hawaii in 1903 and 1904 and had lived on the plantations in Hawaii. But as a fourth generation Korean American, I didn't fully understand the details of their difficult journey of leaving their homeland in order to build, through faith and hard work, a new life in an unknown land. And so in creating tracings, I wanted to make sure that it was an homage to these brave Korean explorers who were in search of a refuge from a politically and economically tumultuous time of Japanese incursion over Korea. They were Christians and were able to acquire passage in exchange for contracts to the plantations of Hawaii. And they lived on the Del Monte plantations on Oahu. And they got married there. They had children. They lost family members due to a lack of good medical care. And for generations wove their way into the fabric of the plantation. They wanted to return to Korea, but this would never happen. And instead, they built a life in America. I unearthed photos, interviewed living relatives, and researched life on the plantation to create the work. And I wanted to just show a few photos of some of my family members and explain who they are and what time period this is. So I'm going to just share my screen for a moment. So this is actually my grandfather's original passport from Korea to America. And what's interesting is that at this time period, you can see that it's written in Chinese versus Korean Hangul. So this is his passport from 1904. And this is my grandfather, Sun Gyun Kang, as a young man. And the young woman with a big bow in her hair with her little sister is Hyovun Kang. And she's my grandmother who married Sun Gyun Kang. And they would live on the plantations their entire life. This is actually the Chai family. And this was my grandmother's parents seated. And then my grandfather and my grandmother are center, and my grandmother's little sister is standing. This is my grandmother, probably an engagement photo. And what I love about this marriage photo of my grandparents is that you can see that there is not only a Western element and a Korean element in terms of she's wearing a traditional hanbok, but also you see the Hawaiian lei, which is around my grandfather's neck. So there was this merging of cultures, this convergence, this confluence, which was happening on the plantations. This is my grandfather on a horse, which he rode as one of the main overseers of the plantation. He worked his way up, and you can see the pineapples in the background, very spiky, thorny pineapples and the rich soil of Hawaii underfoot. And this is my mother as a child. And I just wanted to say that my mom is here today. And so I'm just doing a shout out to my mom. And she's here, as you can see, it's the 1930s. And she's holding a beautiful lily. And this is her a little bit older. And what happened with tracings was that I wanted to have a older Korean woman who would be on stage at the opening of the show and also be on stage at the end of the show, so that there would be the sense that this was a memory work, that in a way it was a seance of her memories bringing forth the remembrances of her family and family experiences. So at the time I kept looking around for a Korean actress. I was looking for an older Korean dancer. And finally, it just hit me. I wonder if I asked my own mother if she would do that walk-on at the Kennedy Center, would she agree? And ultimately she did. So what happened was I was able to tour with my mother. So that last photo was actually our tour to Latvia, to the Latvian Opera House some years ago. But it was a wonderful experience that not only allowed me to better understand the experiences of my family, but also the experiences of Korean immigration to America, and to also have an opportunity to have a very, to really have such a wonderful close experience with my mother too, as we went on tour. And so maybe my mom might be able to say hello for a moment if she can unmute. Are you able to do that, Mom? My mom is over 90 now. She looks amazing. she's an active artist herself. And she has always held the archives of the family as well. So let's see if Mom can unmute for a moment. Can you do that, Mom? Ooh, she's trying. Well, she's very new to Zoom, as many of us probably are, but you can see her her name on her screen is home base, so she might be able to do that in a little while. But I also wanted to talk about some of the symbols in the dance. The costumes are the color of mourning, actually. For traditional Koreans, the color of mourning is white and off-white. The mask, which you saw in the beginning, is actually a traditional Korean dance mask, which represents a young woman. And the cloth, which the dancer holds, this big white cloth, for me, represents the cloth which a traditional Korean shaman actually utilizes in their dances as a representation of the shaman's journey to to another world in order to heal a community. And finally, there were pineapples, because I just knew I had to have pineapples. Oh, I think my mom is unmuted. Do you want to say hi, Mom?
Hi. Hi, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks for being here today.
You're
My
welcome.
mom turned 90 fairly recently, and she grew up on the plantation, and we're just so happy she's here today joining us through the miracle of Zoom and this wonderful opportunity. So thanks, Mom.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I guess at this moment, perhaps we could take some questions from our wonderful audience today.
Thank you so much, Dana. That was beautiful. And I understand there's a happy birthday to your mother. So.
Oh, thank you.
The dance, the performance was exquisite. Can you tell us, so I have a question to start. When you gave us the, first of all, can you just tell us what year this was originally done for and where it went on tour? Just a little bit background of the video.
Sure. So this work originally premiered in 2003 as the centennial of Koreans coming to Hawaii. And the work continues to tour. It's in repertoire in the dance company, and we recently performed it again at the National Portrait Gallery last year, where I'm the choreographer in residence for the Smithsonian. But we've toured it, interestingly, all over the world. It's become one of the most popular pieces we have in repertoire. So we've gone to Europe, all over South America, from Ecuador to Peru to Mexico. And what's interesting about it, which is, I think, the power of art and the power of movement, is I'm a firm believer that dance is a fundamental language that bridges language differences, socioeconomic differences, cultural differences, because we all intrinsically know when someone is sad, for instance, and when someone is elated and they jump, right? So we know this language, it's within our bodies, it's kinesthetic. And so when we've toured it around the world, there has been this wonderful acceptance. In fact, when we were in Ecuador, I was very worried and I thought, oh, I don't know if people are going to understand this dance. I remember being backstage before we went on. And after the dance, people came backstage and they said, oh, we totally understand this experience because we grow pineapples here and we have a long experience with plantations. And when we were in Peru, which has a very large Asian American population, we were inundated with fans, that some of them that had driven for miles, for hours actually, and miles, when we were in a city called Trujillo. And they came backstage and they said, we totally understand this because the Japanese community in Peru also came to Peru around the same time period, turn of the last century, and were agricultural workers. So there's a certain universality that people have, I think, in understanding the immigrant experience, how much hardship and work goes into becoming part of the social and economic fabric of a new land.
We have a number of questions that are coming in from the audience, but one I have to start with is, what kind of preparations go into this type of beautiful performance and this beautiful dance, and how long are those preparations, and then of course what fuels your creativity?
Well, it really takes months to create a dance and to rehearse a dance, because you're trying to get a whole group of individuals on board, having not only the same group consciousness in performance, but also having that muscle memory that they can count on when they go on stage. And so there's the creation process that took months to create this work, and then there was the rehearsal process. And what goes into a dance for me is a lot of research. I am very interested in personal stories, in historical milestones. And at the Smithsonian also, that's one of my specialties. I work with historians, curators. I go through multiple archives to understand the social context of an era that someone might have lived in, and then go from there. So I create a movement vocabulary, and it's sort of like being an author or a writer. I start with movement that then I find motifs in, which might be gestural motifs. And then I build those into longer phrases like paragraphs, into longer sections like chapters. And I'm looking for this arc within the narrative. And the narratives are abstract because it's modern dance, but I think that we fundamentally understand them. And so I'm looking for those peaks and valleys of a story. And that's how I build out the works.
So Jasmine asks, Korean dance, as she understands it, has both expressive and resistant roots, such as the masked dancers critiquing the ruling monarch or for oppressive policies. Has any of this history influenced your approach?
Yes, definitely. I studied Korean dance for a little while, and also studied for this dance. Also, I studied some hula because I was fascinated by figuring out if there was a synergy. And then I was a competitive martial artist when I was a child and teenager, and that's how I came to dance. So there's a certain element of that that's built in as well. But all of those things are very important to me. And one thing that I really think about and contemplate is the spiritual connection between movement and this concept of looking for higher intention. And so all of those things are important to me.
When you talk about creating this language with and gestures, is part of the hula, I understand with hula, there are many things that they're gestures, and it's a conversation that they're telling a story using gestures. Are any of the movements in this adapted from the hula or from any of the Hawaiian influence of dance?
There are some movements, these certain movements of the hands that are inspired by that. The wonderful thing about the hula in terms of being a strong indigenous dance is that it is the repository of history for the Hawaiian people. And so I wouldn't ever say that I'm a hula expert. I'm someone who is deeply appreciative. But I felt that if there were some associations to what were the dance forms going on in the islands at that time period, and what were some of the intersections of different cultures, that it would be appropriate.
Arthur asks, are you in contact with any relatives in Korea? And did your grandparents come from what is now North or South Korea?
My great-grandparents came from Seoul, and we are not in contact with any relatives in Korea or families in Korea. This is, since I'm fourth generation, we're so many generations removed from that. And also what's fascinating, and Julie mentioned this, that in a way, what happens when you immigrate to another country is that you become a repository or a time capsule for different memories that are passed down through stories within a family. And I remember before I went to Korea for the first time, I heard all these stories of what Seoul looked like. And so I was like, I had this completely different expectation. And when I arrived in Korea and I was going down the 6-lane super highway past all these skyscrapers, and people had these amazing cell phones, and mine looked like an antiquated, analog phone. It was like this whole realization that the immigration process does create a certain stopped moments in history and certain very specific memories that we archive from time periods that are passing so quickly, and society is changing so quickly. And every time I go to Korea, which is every couple of years, things are different again. It's like I can't keep up with the construction and the technology. So we're always in moments of change, whether we realize it or not.
When did you, Ellen asks, did you incorporate any traditional Korean dance into the choreography of tracings?
I love the up and down quality of Korean dance in specific steps. So I did incorporate a few steps, and also, but the sense of rhythm and the up and down sort of pabachi that happens within Korean dance or tune.
Leva asks, she thanks you, of course, and I have to concur and agree. This helps better understand the dance and the history of Korean immigration to the United States. Her question is, when and where could you see this performance live? Was it? I think the answer is we'll have it the entirety. Do you think we could put some of it on our website, on our?
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'll make that happen. And if you check our website, which is dtsbdc.org, you can sign up for our newsletter, and we'll keep you informed of performances. And this year's whole season is dedicated to social justice. And so it is dedicated to different stories of major and important icons and historical events that I think allow us to resonate on mentors who have engaged in social justice dialogues in the past. And one of the performances we'll be doing in the fall is also a repertory piece entitled Island, which is based on the Chinese exclusionary acts of the late 1800s. And it's a really fascinating piece. It's based on Angel Island experiences.
And thank you. And so for those of you who are asking, this will be available, the beginning of this recording for today's session will be available on our website as well as on a YouTube recording. So we'll have that posted within just a few days. So if you missed the first half or you're wondering. So this is a question for Dr. Julie Park. Is there an international organization or network of Korean diaspora, and how does that communicate? How does that community facilitate exchange or experiences and connections?
Well, first of all, I just wanted to thank Dana for just sharing so powerful and amazing. So I'm not too familiar with, Dana, are you with international organizations for Korean diaspora? I don't know of any. I know that there's clear ones for Korean adoptees, that's national for the United States, but I don't know of one that's international. Do you?
I think that what I know of is several artists who have worked on and continue to work on projects. One major project is called Kyolpo, and it's by a photographer named Sijo. And this particular word Kyolpo relates to individuals that lived and grew up like outside of Korea itself. It used to have a negative connotation, which is now, I think, being reclaimed for hopefully a positive connotation. And, I'm sorry, I just noticed on my Zoom screen that Dr. Yang Ro-yoon is here, and I wanted to thank her for all of her support of Korean American art and really supporting these dialogues as well. So thank you for being here today.
And actually, Dr. Youngo has a question and she'd like to pose it herself. So if you'd like to go ahead and unmute, please.
Thank you, Dana. And it was really wonderful to see you again, the dance. And I have two questions. One question for Professor Park. You have talked about this Korean American now, and I completely agree with the Sandra Oh. This is not only for Korean American immigrant history. This is a real story of any American immigrants, and that's, I think, powerful. And at this particular time, we really should remind ourselves of the power and beauty of America, which really appreciates and somehow digest the commonality and the add diversity. So Korean American at this point, not too much Korean American or Asian American. Yes, this is a great opportunity for us to take this tragedy into the some moment of understanding and the commonality first. We think too much about, in terms of diversity, we seem to think too much about the difference, but we have a lot of commonality, and this is the country which really appreciates. I'm not even Korean American, I'm a Korean, but please, I really find it powerful. So in that sense, my question to Professor Park is, what is the integration status of the Korean American? Since the LA riot, it has become better, but would it be good to know about it? And my question to Dana is, you said that the dance is really universal language. So you go to, you went to many different countries in many different continents. So I'm wondering, even if it's universal language, when you go to the different countries, you try to, do you a little bit like slightly change or adjust some part to make a more connection to those people in that country? Thank you very much for all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. And thank you for your statement. I think certainly that's why I found it so powerful, and I wanted to end with the quote by Sandra Oh, because quintessentially, I think the story is one of the United States of immigrants coming and persevering. And it's not that it's the film is a happy-go-lucky, super, pie in the sky type of movie, but it does give you this deep sense of commonality, as you said. I think currently, as my research focuses on intergenerational mobility, and certainly we do see that for the second generation Korean Americans, as we see all the way to the fourth generation, as in the case of Dana. There certainly is quite a bit of economic and social mobility, but at the same time, there's there can be an emotional and psychological cost, I think, and also kind of a different way of thinking about the sandwich generation, where they're continuing to take care of their parents as they did when they were children, and now having children. Talk about really kind of this kind of lifelong parenting of not only their own parents, but of their own children. And I think, for many, I interviewed one person who had a business in Los Angeles, Koreatown, when there was the civil unrest in 1992. And I think for many, it was a profoundly scarring and a wounding that occurred. But also there's been such productive conversations about how we're completely missing the picture or misdiagnosing the situation if we think and we bring it down to just a Korean Black conflict, that there's just so much more to it than that. And so there's been a lot of healing and I think coalition building amongst Korean Americans and African Americans. And I think this past year, you see much more of that, where there's a solidarity and coalition building, which I think is very encouraging.
Thank you.
Yes. And in terms of the second question, I really look at cultural diplomacy when I'm touring abroad with the company as fundamentally long-term friendship building, right? And in order to do that, I make sure that we don't just perform, but we also teach workshops. I often will go early, several weeks early to a site and create a piece of choreography that is given to a dance company. For example, the National Ballet of Peru has a whole evening of my work that was set and also created there, and they continue to perform to this day. So it really is about what are all the different things within an artist's toolbox that I can utilize to ensure that there is a long-term relationship with another country. And I think that's what diplomacy is.
Normally we would be ending at 1 o'clock, but we have a number of other questions. I will keep the line open and I welcome, we'll continue to answer. Dana, if that's okay, we'll have a few more minutes to answer some questions.
Sure.
Okay, great, thank you. And Dr. Park, just a few more minutes? Okay.
Sure, I'm teaching, but I will stay on for a few more minutes.
Okay, thank you, I appreciate it. We have people who are the first generation immigrants and they are thanking you about connecting us actually through our all shared human experience. And the questions that we have are where they can access this. It's either at the Dana Tysoon Burgess Dance Company website and at the Woodrow Wilson House.org. I have one other question, and that is regarding, is there any influence from Sankai Juku?
Oh, no, I really appreciate Buto dance, but I don't consider what I do Buto. It's definitely modern dance, but I'm very appreciative of their work for sure.
And is there any comment, how are there organizations where we can, in light of what's happening, what happened in Atlanta, is there something, suggestions for the communities to be reaching out to assisting in our own ways with the challenges that we're facing right now for racial and justice and social justice?
Sure. In the chat, I just shared our website, and you can't miss it. There'll be a link to resources and places that you can give to. I would highly recommend folks going to the website of Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta. They've really kind of had the pulse on what's going on, and they also share ways in which you can take some small action during this time.
I think we all kind of we'd like to share and show our support for fellow Americans with Asian descent. So especially now with the racism that they're facing. I think that's our last question, and then we'll let you go to class. Can either you, Dr. Park or Dana, comment on the current hallyu that we're seeing for Korean dramas, etc.?
Julie, did you want to say something? Or?
Sure, maybe I should start by saying I love BTS. I don't watch Korean of them. I think it's an interesting phenomenon, and I think this the youngest generation currently has really been shifting our notions of how to understand culture, that it's extremely transnational and international, and the boundaries kind of that we understand around even common shared language has been completely broken down. And I think, you know, kind of with the rise of Korean entertainment, BTS, Parasite last year, I think Korean Americans are really grappling and perhaps in many ways embracing this kind of transnational and kind of also maybe, you know, origin kind of culture as it relates to pop culture. Dana, did you want to add anything to that? It's a very interesting moment, I think.
I think that what's fascinating about it is also as well is that our platforms, as you were saying, like the platforms of where we're getting information are changing. And when I speak to students from middle school onward, you know, they're also utilizing platforms like TikTok, which are associated to K-pop, specifically fans. So I think that there are now these multiple places where Korean American artists are being seen and being heard.
Well, thank you so much, Dana, and thank you, Dr. Julie Park. We're going to let you get back to your class and teaching your students. Thank you, everyone. This was just a beautiful, wonderful way to spend today, learning so much and feeling really enlightened, and knowing that there are ways that we can support one another and find the commonality in all of us. And so I thank you and I appreciate it. Thank you to the audience for participating and for joining us. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a talk on Edith Wilson. It will be about Edith Wilson as a bold, courageous, and dynamic woman. And so learn more about Edith in 2 weeks. Join us here on Tuesday for our Lunch and Learn session speaker series at the Woodrow Wilson House. I thank you all and have a great afternoon, and peace to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.